Hello everyone. Today, we're going to talk about a shocking and important event in American history, the Whiskey Rebellion. What exactly was this rebellion? Why did ordinary American farmers rise against their own federal government? How did a simple whiskey tax create so much anger across an entire region? And why did President George Washington eventually have to gather soldiers to stop the rebellion? You'll discover the answers to all these questions in this video, so make sure you watch until the end. Our story begins after the American Revolution, when America had finally won independence from British rule. But independence did not mean everything was suddenly easy. The new country faced a huge problem: money and debt. During the Revolutionary War, the American government had accumulated enormous debts that now needed to be paid. The new federal government also needed money to operate the country and build a stronger financial system. Around 1790, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton began creating a stronger financial system for the young United States. One important part of Hamilton's plan was placing a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, especially whiskey. In 1791, the whiskey tax officially took effect. For the government, it was simply a way to raise revenue. But for many farmers in western Pennsylvania, this tax meant something completely different. Many farmers grew corn, rye, and other grains, but transporting those grains over long distances was difficult and expensive. So many farmers turned their grain into whiskey, which was much easier to transport and sell. For these farmers, whiskey was not simply a drink. It was an important source of income and livelihood. Then the federal government placed a tax on whiskey, and anger among the farmers began to grow. Small distillers were especially unhappy because the tax was difficult for them to afford. Another major problem was that the tax had to be paid in cash, which many frontier farmers did not have. The farmers began asking themselves, why is our own government taxing us after we fought for independence? At first, the resistance was peaceful. People held meetings, sent petitions, and demanded changes to the tax law. But the government refused to remove the tax, and frustration continued growing across western Pennsylvania. Some protesters began threatening tax collectors and federal officials, while others simply refused to pay the tax. Slowly, peaceful protest began turning into something much more dangerous: violent resistance. Then came the year 1794, when the Whiskey Rebellion reached its most dangerous stage. Federal revenue officials were trying to enforce the tax, but armed resistance groups stood against them. In July 1794, events involving U.S. Marshal David Lennox and Revenue Inspector John Neville made the situation even worse. Neville's home at Bower Hill was attacked, and eventually, the house was burned to the ground. Now, the federal government was facing something much bigger than an ordinary tax protest. It had become armed resistance against federal law, and President George Washington faced a serious decision. If Washington did nothing, others might believe that federal laws could simply be ignored without consequences. But sending soldiers against American citizens was also an extremely difficult decision for the new president. Washington first tried to solve the crisis peacefully and avoid a military confrontation. But the violence and resistance continued, and eventually Washington decided that military force was necessary. The federal government began gathering militia forces from several states to restore order. Around 12,000 soldiers were mobilized, creating a massive force for the young American government. Then came an extraordinary moment. President George Washington himself traveled toward Pennsylvania with the militia. Think about that. The President of the United States was leading soldiers toward his own citizens. But it is important to understand that the Whiskey Rebellion did not become a huge battle like the Civil War. As Washington's massive military force approached, the organized resistance of the rebels began to collapse. Many suspected rebels were arrested, and several people faced serious accusations for their involvement in the rebellion. Some were even accused of treason, one of the most serious crimes against the government. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, and President Washington later pardoned both of them. But what happened to the whiskey tax itself? The federal government continued trying to enforce it for some time. However, enforcing the tax remained difficult, especially in the frontier regions where resistance had been strongest. Finally, in 1802, President Thomas Jefferson's administration repealed the federal whiskey excise tax. But the most important result of the Whiskey Rebellion was not simply the end of the tax. The rebellion had tested the strength and authority of America's new federal government. For the first time, The young government faced major internal resistance to federal law, and Washington's government showed that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws. The rebellion sent a powerful message. Federal law was not simply something written on paper. If armed groups openly resisted federal law, the government could take action against them, and that is one major reason why the Whiskey Rebellion remains important in American history. But this story was never simply about whiskey or a single tax. It was about a new nation struggling to balance individual freedom, economic survival, and government authority. On one side were angry farmers trying to protect their livelihoods and what they believed were their rights. On the other side was a young federal government determined to protect its authority and enforce its laws. One tax had brought these two sides into direct conflict, creating one of the earliest major tests of the new republic. And although the rebellion never became a massive war, it left a powerful mark on American history. The Whiskey Rebellion showed that America's new federal government was strong enough to enforce its laws, but it also showed how quickly ordinary citizens could become angry when government policies threatened their livelihoods. That is why the Whiskey Rebellion was about much more than whiskey. It was a conflict involving taxes, livelihood, government power, political resistance, and the meaning of freedom. A simple tax had created a crisis that became an important test for the young American Republic. And that is the story of the Whiskey Rebellion, a rebellion that helped shape the power of the United States government.
If you enjoy historical documentaries like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below.
Tell us which historical event you want us to explore in the next documentary. Thank you for watching.